Welcome to another episode of the Family Futures podcast series, Pondering Pods. If you have a topic you'd like to know more about, you can email us with your suggestion at contact@familyfutures.co.uk. Welcome to another episode of the Family Futures podcast. I am here today with Vaughan MBE, co-founder of Family Futures and CEO of Family Futures. Hello.
Hello.
We are going to be talking about NPP, which is Neuro Physiological Psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And am I right in thinking that is the very, broadly speaking, the relationship between the brain and the body?
Yes, absolutely.
Have I got that correct?
Spot on.
Okay, amazing. This is going well. I've spoken about NPP before with another member of the therapy team, Colleen. That was a couple of years ago, and it was just kind of an overview of what NPP kind of meant and sort of what it looked like as well, just to give people a bit of a flavour, because I know that we throw around the phrase NPP quite a lot. And what I think would be helpful to begin with, because co-founder of Family Futures, but co-founder of NPP as a therapeutic model, would be if you could give us just a really brief, simplistic as possible, explanation of what NPP is, what it looks like.
Okay. It might help if I begin by giving you a bit of the history.
Yeah.
Because Family Futures set up in 1998, but prior to this we'd begun to model a different way of working with families that was dyadic, that had the parents very much part of the therapy team collaborating together, that it was family based. So there was lots of an emphasis on family work, parents being a part of the therapy, and parents knowing what was happening with their child. So it wasn't individual confidential therapy for the child, it was family based approach where the parents were kept informed of what was going on, if there were individual sessions, and where the main emphasis of the therapy was on dyadic work. Now,
and by dyadic, I'm just really conscious of us using lots of jargon.
Yeah.
What do you mean by dyadic?
Dyadic, I mean that you have parent and child together in the therapy sessions.
Okay.
That there is a dyad of two that are in the therapy. This, now we take it for granted. We've got DDP, which is dyadic. We've got Theraplay, which is dyadic, and we've got NPP, which is dyadic. And lots of practitioners, whether they're trained in art therapy, drama therapy, are using a dyadic approach.
Yeah.
So we've come a long way from the late 90s, where it was a really unusual thing. Unless you're doing family therapy, to have the parent in the room was not standard practice.
Okay.
And this grew out of a parent movement. The Adoption UK back then was called PPIAS. Very catchy, so they changed it to Adoption UK. And they were passionately saying therapy was not working and they wanted to change. And out of that movement, we developed a model of working prior to Family Futures, or on the sort of cusp of Family Futures being set up, which was about doing something different and recognising therapy, individual, confidential therapy for children, was not actually working for kids who have care experience and were traumatised. So what we began with was really an interest in what could we do differently, because if we recognise that the standard model of therapy is not working, we looked to America and the dyadic work they were doing in the States. They weren't calling it dyadic at that point, but we looked to using the arts therapy in a very different way to really try and help families. So what we did from 98, from sort of inception in 1998 through until the early 2000s, is we did Family Futures therapy. And for years it was it was the Family Futures therapy model.
Yeah.
But then everyone started getting names for their model. So Dan was calling what was Dan Hughes 1, 2 and 3 became DDP level 1 and level 2. So out of this, the team at Family Futures got together and we thought, well, we need a name. We can't just keep calling it Family Futures Therapy. So we brainstormed as a team and we came up, well, what were the key words? And we decided the brain, neuro, the body, physiological, and psychotherapy were the words that really summarised what we were doing. historically, the other key thing to mention is that we had been working initially on attachment as the main problem. Back in the 98, we were thinking it was about attachment, that these children had broken, ruptured attachments from the early experience, and in their new families, be they adoptive, fostered or special guardianship families, they needed the attachment piece, needed to be the focus of the therapy. After a while, it then became clear that it was really more than just the attachment that was the issue. We really needed to think about trauma. Around this time, Van der Kolk and other psychiatrists in the States were talking developmental trauma, and that for us made perfect sense. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was a term used for Vietnam War veterans, didn't work for traumatized children. But if you took the term developmental trauma, now we're thinking complex trauma, that made sense, that it was a way that the whole physiology of the child was impacted, and that one has to take account that often parents were traumatized. Having had a traumatized child placed with them, they were being impacted by that trauma being imported into their family. So we had a traumatized family system, and that we needed not just to think attachment, we needed to think trauma. The other piece to this is that we began to think of the body. We began to think, well, actually, it isn't just how we think and feel about the world that's impacted by trauma. It's the physiology of the body, which is why we believed that we needed the word physiology in our title. The last thing I'll mention, because I know I'm going on a bit, is Alan Burnell wrote an article in 2006 called The Elephant in the Room. And in that article, he outlined a model of therapy that was brain-based. So it was the very first draft of the NPP model, in that it looked at what therapy interventions you need at the different levels of the brain. And that's where we began to define, for primitive brain responses, there are a particular focus of the work and the particular methods or modalities of therapy. For I'm forgetting the word, oh my goodness. For the limbic brain, then there's another level of intervention. And for cortical brain, higher brain thinking, reflective thinking, you needed a different form of intervention. So that was really the beginning of NPP. Right in that article, we were encouraged by our consultant at the time that we needed to put this in writing and nail this as our approach, which is why the article's so important for us. And then it was sometime after that we came up with the title Neuro Physiological Psychotherapy, which for us conveyed that importance of working with body and brain together to really help traumatized children heal.
Okay, that was very helpful, having the context of it.
Thank you.
And that makes sense. I mean, in terms of it becoming the NPP model and what it looks like in practice, so it sounds like it's the different types of therapy based on what that child needs in that session or in that moment in that session.
Okay, that's a very good question. So it's two things. So we believe that this neurosequential approach, which is how it's termed generally, involves work that ultimately in therapy works from regulating, getting the child calm, and the parents sometimes too, calm and regulated and able to feel safe, feel calm and manage in the moment and in the session and in the therapy, to helping them get into relationship. So they're not regulated but on their own, but they're actually managing to be in relationship, to helping them begin to reflect. So we go from regulate to relate to reflect. Now that process is the general trajectory you want to go in therapy, that you want to help the child move from being calm, safe, in relationship to making sense of their life and reflecting on it. But also that process can happen in the context of one session or one moment in a session. So you can start a session, everyone calm, happy, things going well, something difficult gets raised, and you immediately find that the young person or the child is triggered back into being dysregulated, and you need to go back to the regulation work to then get them back into relationships, to then go back to reflecting on what's happening. So you have a general trajectory of the way therapy should go: regulate, relate, reflect. And you also have a process that might happen in cycles throughout the session. that you go through that cycle of, oops, we need to go back to regulation. Oh, get back into relationship. Now we can make sense of what happened.
Okay.
So, yeah, both really.
And is there, from what you've just described then, it's sort of hard to imagine that, okay, we'll book you in for 8 therapy sessions and then see.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that is actually a way of approaching kind of booking in sessions and looking at some packages of support, I guess. Is it for some families, some children, young people, when you first start looking at their needs and their level of trauma and how they're presenting, are you able to go, okay, we think it's gonna take this amount of time, or is it we're gonna have to start and see?
Okay, it depends. I mean, there is the ideal, which I think all families should be offered. Yeah. And all families and traumatized children who have that early experience of trauma and attachment difficulties in my view, needs long-term work.
Yeah.
And that is the ideal. I would dearly love that offered to everybody in the UK in different shapes and forms. I think it would really change the outcomes for children and for people. Mm. We see these patterns repeated across generations. The care system, children are really high in the prison population, in the psychiatric population, in the homeless, and this ultimately is a huge cost emotionally and financially to society. So I have an ideal. I appreciate Family Future's ideal may not fit with the budget constraints that's going on, and we have had to learn to move away perhaps at times from our ideal to being a bit more pragmatic. I think there are children we see that come in through our treatment service who sometimes early in placement are doing okay, and they can cope with a much smaller package of intervention, more within the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund's 5K package. Yeah. There are times that is possible. More than times. There are children and families where you can do something good that is sufficient. They may need long term, but you can do a lesser program
kind of periodically,
and they can dip in out whenever they need it. Exactly. We've also found with our iAdopt placements that if you put the early intervention in, actually they can fare pretty good.
Yeah.
And we are having young people get to adulthood without having needed high level intervention. Yeah, there have been challenges along the way, but it hasn't reached, on the whole, the same crisis point. It's been a much more positive trajectory. So I think that's important, and it's something we're going to be looking at in one of our next phases of research. But actually, it's possible with iAdopt to show that if we do it right from the beginning, no parent in parent preparation can really know what it's going to feel like to have a traumatized child in your life. There's just no way. But if you can, from early on, provide that support that takes a neurophysiological approach, that is looking at helping the child get regulated, helping them feel safe, helping them get into a good relationship with their new parent, then I think the trajectory can be better. And, as I'm sure some will be pleased to hear, cheaper. But what we see through the treatment service, which is the bit that really worries me, is really terrible things coming in. Families in desperate states, children who are profoundly traumatized, where 5K does not touch the sides. And that's the population of families we're failing. I believe we could set up a really good system in the UK of early intervention and getting that right. And that would ultimately show good outcomes and would be able to track it and do the research to check that really is working. There will be some within that group who something else will happen and they're going to need high level. But I think we could get to the point with early intervention where the majority are faring better. I still think some of the early interventions that are put in place aren't always appropriate for certain families, but maybe that's another discussion. But what we need to be really addressing is, okay, for some families, we can do a good job with the 5K. For other families, we are woefully inadequate. 5K is not sufficient. The extent of complexity of the trauma bond between the siblings, the child's history is profoundly traumatized. and they are hugely struggling, and the parents are exhausted, stressed, overwhelmed, isolated at the end of their tether and showing signs of trauma themselves. It's those families that we are not getting right at the moment.
And I think what we've just illustrated there is that you can't have this conversation without talking about budget and money and financing it and how this work is actually going to happen. Irrespective of who's doing it, it has to be funded in some way, and you can't escape the two things coexist, unfortunately. Bringing it back to my notes, we've sort of strayed a little bit there. What we wanted to talk about was the research that has been done around NPP and its effect, and the effect it has on the children that have been through the full model. So we've spoken about the model. So the full model, when we're talking about that, what do you mean by the full model? Is it an ideal, obviously not number of sessions given what we've just said, but what is that? Okay. Is that easy to summarise?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the full model is slightly different depending on who you are and what your experiences have been and what you're requiring. But generally, we could say that the full model is a more wraparound approach that isn't just doing therapy, but is liaising with the school, providing a high level of parent support. So it's much more holistic than sometimes everything gets whittled down to. It also is longer than 1 year. So we've now moved into a world where things are done in financial years, and you don't know that there's going to be another financial year at the end of one financial year, not necessarily. So the full model to date, and we still do have families that have the full model, is 3 years generally minimum, sometimes longer, sometimes considerably longer, depending on the child's history and what's happened to them, and is a really wraparound approach at a more intensive level than 1 hour per week or 2 hours per month, a half day or a full day per month. It's more intensive than that. And
that's our testing group. So just to give people an idea, so the research that we've done is based on this specific group of children and young people who have been through the full model. So they've had the longer term therapeutic intervention. It's been more intensive. The school have been involved. Education has been involved. And they've kind of checked all of those boxes. And so the research is based off of that specific group.
It is. I should say that specific group does have in it some cases where at the multidisciplinary assessment stage we've said, okay, this is not a crisis point. We can see some warning signs of problems ahead, but a lower level of package of support is needed, or they don't so much need the regulation piece. That child's pretty regulated and pretty attached, but they really need help making sense of their history, being able to do the reflective work. So the full model is the model that is appropriate for that child, rather than we blanketly apply
to every
NPP to everyone, every element to everyone. Because if a family come forward and they don't need the regulation piece and the attachment actually is in pretty good shape, and they're using their attachment figure for support, then you can just do the reflective work, the life story work, the identity work, helping them make sense of their history, helping them understand why certain things are hard. That's not for the majority, but there are cases in our cohort of data, particularly the updated data set that we're using, which has, so when I say updated, we have the data set for the original research in 2016 and the comparison group in 2019. We now have added to our data set from those bits of research and more than doubled the amount of families in the programme who have completed the full model. So our updated data set has more families where there has been the model applied specifically to them who perhaps didn't have such a high level of need.
So, I mean, after 25 years, I imagine we've got quite a big group of people.
We have.
And as you said, it wouldn't be in keeping with our ethos to be taking a one-size-fits-all approach, which we just don't really in any way of working from assessment to treatment.
Exactly, it has to be bespoke. Can I just say one other thing, because sometimes people get confused about this. So the data set that we used for the original research in 16 and the comparison group in 19 sadly could only include families where we had used psychometric tools.
Okay.
So when we first began in 98, there were no psychometric tools. This wasn't something that wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
As psychometric tools, we began to use them in a standard way. We could only use the data for that because we needed the psychometric tools to be used before treatment and after treatment. So there is quite a sizable number of families who've had the full NPP model, but we didn't have the psychometric tools at that point. So we could only count the ones from when we brought in a proper battery of psychometric tools.
Do you know when that was? No.
I don't off the top of my
I think
head.
we will be doing another podcast.
Elaine will know that.
Elaine will be doing the podcast about the research, but I just wanted to kind of give a bit of an overview. And the research that was published in 2016 looked at the outcomes for the children.
Yeah.
And the research that was published in 2019 provides the supporting evidence that it's the therapeutic intervention, it's the neurosequential approach, and it's also, as you mentioned, the holistic wraparound approach. And what I found quite interesting about the research, just generally what evidence is all the different areas it affects. So it's not just looking at the child's well-being and how well they're coping. It's looking at their relationships, so there's sibling relationships, friend relationships, parent-child relationships, the family setup, so whether or not that family have stayed together over the course of that child's treatment, that child's mental health, child or young person, their experience of the education system, and whether or not they've become involved in the criminal or engaged with the criminal justice system. And I will be linking this in the show notes, but the graphs that show what the research has found and what it's evidenced are quite shocking. The comparison between children and young people who have had that level of treatment and the children who haven't. So I'd really encourage anyone listening to have a little look. It's really well presented in terms of the findings, so it's really kind of easy to read and engage with if you feel slightly off put by thinking about reading a whole research paper, which I was like, oh no. But the way it's been summarised is actually really, really helpful. So I guess to kind of, I feel like there is so much to talk about, but to kind of round up, what is it that makes NPP so unique? So you mentioned at the beginning, everyone was naming their therapy models. Are there other models we've seen since, or you've heard of since, that don't quite do the same thing? Or just kind of what makes NPP so unique? And could you argue that any type of therapy or support would make an impact, or would it not make quite enough of an impact? So if you're just talking family therapy, for example.
Okay, I'm going to get myself into difficulties if I start.
Let's not
saying something.
I don't mean name and shame, but I mean, what about? Okay, let's just go back to the less leading question. Of what makes it unique.
Okay, I think NPP is an integrative model. So it's not about the individual parts, it's about the sum of the whole thing altogether. And it's about the underlying ethos that it's family-based, it's parent-friendly, it understands how trauma impacts a child, it works to regulate and understand how traumatised children and their bodies are impacted and how to support them. It uses a range of different modalities. And whenever someone new joins the team, they bring their passion, their enthusiasm, and their way of working can be integrated into the NPP model. So it's always rich and evolving with different enthusiasms and talents within the team. But it's about understanding. So it's not about the modality. It's about understanding what's happening neurologically and physiologically in the child's body and brain, how to help them regulate, tracking what's going on, and knowing when to come in with the right intervention. and what to do to work with a family as a whole rather than working with a child individually. So it is a pulling together of a range of different ways of working with a family that is family based, and with the child and parents to help them find a way to understand what's going on, because often families come and they don't understand why eating is such an issue, why the body temperature of the child is problematic, why sleeping so hard, why they're so explosive, what's triggering them, how to help them regulate, why they're so rejecting or struggling so much. And for children, this is often for them, they feel like they're still living in their trauma world, that they're stuck, lost somewhere back. They don't know what's happening. It feels terrifying. And I think helping people make sense of what's going on has to be the first step of a good intervention. Helping them feel you're on side with them, helping them feel that you do understand. You might not have all the magic answers, but you do understand, and you can help them find a way through it, and they're not crazy. This is about how trauma impacts the human being.
And everyone happens. Differently.
And everyone slightly differently, but there are common threads. I wondered if it would be helpful just to say, because you were referring to the pie charts, and I think the pie charts done by one of our fabulous assistant psychologists is fantastic because it makes it so clear. So the comparison group study that we did in 19, so in 16 we wrote an article on the model, and we wrote an article looking at the psychometric results, the sort of research data, what happens when you looked at before and after. And we were really delighted and very pleased and relieved to see that actually we made a difference. We made a statistically significant difference to the child, and you could see that their behaviours had changed and they were sustaining those changes. So that was really, really very pleasing. We looked at the comparison group at 19 to try and see, well, if you hadn't had the full treatment model, we thought, well, maybe you went somewhere else and had some other intervention and things worked out fine. We sort of hoped that our model made a difference, but we weren't sure what would happen if you looked at a comparison group. The comparison group in 19 were rather shocking and deeply distressing. I mean, of course, we wanted our model to be positive and to have a difference, but we didn't expect how bad things were for the people that had come for an assessment and didn't get it. It's something as a society we should be ashamed of. Death, divorce, disruption, in prison, profoundly traumatized. They were in a pitiful state. It was awful for the assistant psychologists who visited them and interviewed them. We did see some for free intervention to offer some help because we were so worried about the states they're in. It was really bad. And then you can see that in the pie charts, that it was really shocking, the difference. I should also add that we are currently doing an audit of all of our full model cases, adding in the new data set, which has more than doubled our data, making it a really significant, sizable group that's the biggest that's out there. And we are looking at how many of those children have FASD or highly likely have FASD or may have SASD.
And FASD, for those listening.
I'm so sorry. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Yes. We will be doing another podcast on that
so
specifically with our expert.
Okay. So we're looking to see, because it is accepted that lots of children from the care system have that in utero experience of alcohol. And we are now looking at our data to see what are the outcomes for children who've had the full model who have alcohol in utero. And the data crunch that has just been carried out, I've been told, by Elaine McCulloch, Dr. Elaine McCulloch, who is our consultant psychologist and who is leading the research programme. And she's saying that the results are really positive, and you can really see a distinction for children who've had the full model and good outcomes being sustained, particularly if they have alcohol in utero, which we're all a bit surprised by, but it looks like we are particularly successful with that population of children improving things. We've also been able to see, I think the early indications, Elaine will clarify this more when you talk to her, are that our education work, which no longer exists, and the education outcomes are not as good as they were for this new data set, we have to hypothesize that this might be because we've basically closed our education service. There is some education support at Family Futures, but we used to have a whole service and a team that was staff doing that. And with the Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund not funding any education work, this work has not been so much a part of our model. It's a much smaller element now.
And it's had an impact. Or it's looking like it.
It's looking like it's had an impact. We're still working out what it all means. We're hoping to get this next tranche of research published this year, 2024. I know you're going to be talking to Dr. Elaine McCulloch about this. And I suppose what I hope, Family Futures are not looking to open more offices, take over the world. Okay, it's quite sufficient managing the building in Hornsey and the team there. What we want is to change thinking, to get people to accept that we have some of the most profoundly traumatized children in the country in the care system or being placed in SGO or adoptive families. And we know that the histories, the transgenerational transmission of trauma goes on and on across generations and have huge emotional and financial costs into the future, as I said at the beginning. What we want is for us to have a rethink about what we do, because actually the costs are coming later. If we invested in getting it right early on, we could change this trajectory. And that isn't to say Family Futures does it everywhere, but that there is a model that we believe can make a difference, that we could apply more, that we could do early intervention.
So it's the right interventions at the right time.
Exactly. And that will save costs. Surely that has to be popular.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we need to invest.
Yeah.
And we're not investing properly at this point. There are good things going on around the country in different pockets, but we need a coherent approach. We need multidisciplinary assessments for all the children who are being placed. We need early intervention, and we need to look at the red flags, because there are red flags. When we know in certain things in children's history will mean they will need more support. And if we can get that right, we can change the trajectory, or we can make it significantly better and stop all the suffering that children, young people, their families, their extended families, the education system, the ripple effect of the trauma that pervades across all areas.
Thank you. That feels like a really appropriate point to end on. I had some other questions, but I think you've really said it all, and you've made quite a powerful point there.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Family Futures podcast, why not subscribe or leave us a review? Want to know more about Family Futures? Visit our website, www.familyfutures.co.uk.